Hello, wanderer of the night. Welcome back to the Midnight Explorer, where we journey through time and memory, where history whispers its secrets, and where the ordinary becomes extraordinary under the moon's gentle gaze. Tonight, pull your blankets close, dim the lights, let the world outside fade to a soft murmur, because tonight we're not traveling to distant kingdoms or lost civilizations. No, tonight we're journeying somewhere much closer, somewhere hiding in plain sight, right there on your dinner plate, in your kitchen garden, in the very soil beneath your feet. Tonight, we explore the secret lives of vegetables. I know what you're thinking. Vegetables for a bedtime story? But stay with me, dear listener, because these humble beings, these roots and leaves, these fruits of the earth, carry within them stories more ancient than empires, more dramatic than wars, more intimate than love letters. They've crossed oceans, they've toppled governments, they've saved millions of lives and ended countless others. They've been worshipped as gods and condemned as poisons. They've shaped civilizations and traveled further than most of us ever will. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let me tell you about the vegetables that made our world. It's 40,000 years ago, maybe 50. Time moves differently that far back, doesn't it? Like trying to count stars. The exact number doesn't matter as much as the vastness. You are standing in a forest, not the manicured, photographable forests we know today, but something older, wilder, more honest. The trees tower above you like cathedral pillars, their branches weaving a canopy so thick that even at midday the light filters down in silver-green threads. The air is heavy with moisture and the scent of decay and growth happening simultaneously. That rich, loamy smell of earth doing what earth does best, creating life from death, over and over in an endless wheel. You are hungry. You've been hungry before. We all have. But this is different. This is a hunger that gnaws at your belly like a living thing. A hunger that makes your hands tremble and your vision swim. A hunger that you know, with the certainty of instinct, could end you if you don't find something, anything, to quiet its demands. So you search. Your eyes scan the undergrowth, looking for familiar shapes, colors, patterns. Your ancestors learned some things, and they taught you, and their ancestors taught them. You know which berries paint your lips sweet, and which will make you convulse and vomit. You know which mushrooms are gifts and which are tiny deaths hiding under innocent caps. You know these things because the ones who didn't learn them, well, they aren't here to be your ancestors, are they? And then you see it. A plant. Nothing spectacular, no bright flowers, no obvious fruit, just leaves, green and broad, rising from the dark soil. But something draws you closer. Maybe it's intuition, maybe it's desperation, maybe it's just the kind of chance that repeated enough times across enough hungry humans becomes inevitability. You grab the plant and pull. The earth resists for a moment, holding its treasure close, then releases with a soft sigh of soil and root. And there, covered in dark earth, is something you didn't expect. Something thick and pale growing beneath the surface where you couldn't see it. A root, swollen with stored sunlight and rain, with all the patient work of the plant gathering energy for tomorrow. You brush away the dirt with trembling fingers. You've found roots before, sure, but this one is different, substantial, promising. You bite into it, expecting bitterness, expecting the sharp punishment of toxins. But instead, there's sweetness. Mild, yes, but real. There's substance, there's comfort, there's relief flooding through you like warm water. You have just discovered the wild ancestor of the carrot, or perhaps the parsnip, or the turnip, or any of a dozen roots that would, over the next 40,000 years, become so familiar, so domestic, so deeply woven into human survival that we'd forget they were ever wild at all. This is where the story of vegetables begins, dear listener. Not in some Garden of Eden, not handed down from the heavens, but in dirt and desperation and the slow, patient observation of hungry people learning to see what the earth had been offering all along. The word vegetable itself is a strange, modern invention. It's not a botanical term. Scientists don't use it. It's a culinary word, a cultural word, a word that means different things in different places. In essence, a vegetable is any part of a plant we've decided to eat. Roots, stems, leaves, flowers, seeds, or fruits that aren't sweet enough to be called fruits. It's a human category for human purposes. But before we had words, before we had categories, before we had kitchens and gardens and agriculture, we had this: hungry humans and wild plants, and the long, slow dance and learning which parts of which plants could quiet the hunger that lived inside us like a second heartbeat. For most of human existence, hundreds of thousands of years, we were foragers. Hunter-gatherers, we call them now, though that phrase doesn't quite capture the intimacy of the relationship. We didn't hunt nature so much as participate in it, move through it like a thread in a vast tapestry. And the plants we gathered weren't crops or ingredients. They were partners in survival, teachers, sometimes betrayers, always mysterious. Our ancestors developed what anthropologists call landscape knowledge, an encyclopedic understanding of the natural world that most of us today couldn't begin to replicate. They knew when the first shoots would appear after the spring rains. They knew which hillsides would flower first and which would hold their harvest longest. They knew the plants by their leaves, their stems, their flowers, their scent, their taste, their season, their companions. They knew which parts to eat and which to avoid, which to cook and which to eat raw, which were most nourishing and which were merely filling. And slowly, so slowly that no single generation would have noticed the change, something began to shift. Certain plants started appearing more often around human camps, not by accident, but because humans, in eating them, were spreading their seeds. Because humans, in preferring certain flavors or sizes, were inadvertently selecting which plants survived to produce the next generation. Because humans, in returning to the same places season after season, were creating disturbances in the soil that favored certain species over others. The plants were changing us, and we were changing them, in a dance neither partner fully controlled. This is the secret that vegetables carry in their cells, dear listener. They are not human inventions. They are co-creations. They are the result of the longest collaborative project in human history, the 10,000-year conversation between human hunger and plant survival, between human desire and botanical possibility. Every vegetable you've ever eaten is a living archive of this conversation. Every carrot carries within it the memory of those first wild roots pulled from the earth by trembling, hungry hands. Every tomato remembers when its ancestors were small and bitter and possibly toxic before humans loved them into sweetness. Every head of lettuce is a monument to patience, to the slow accumulation of tiny choices across hundreds of generations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Forgive me. That's the danger of loving a story too much. You want to tell it all at once, to spread the whole feast before you immediately. But stories, like vegetables, are best savored slowly, one piece at a time. So let's return to the beginning. Let's return to hunger and earth and the moment when everything changed. Think about that for a moment. Really let it settle into your bones. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were mobile. We followed the herds, the seasons, the ripening fruit, the running water. We were part of the landscape's rhythm, moving with it like birds migrate, like salmon return to their birthplace to spawn. But then, in different parts of the world at roughly the same time, which is to say, within a few thousand years of each other, which from the Earth's perspective is roughly the same time, humans made a decision. A decision so profound, so irreversible, that we're still living with its consequences today. We decided to stay. And to stay meant to garden. To garden meant to select. To select meant to change. And to change the plants meant to change ourselves. The earliest evidence of agriculture appears around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from modern-day Egypt through Israel and Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. But don't imagine neat rows of crops and efficient irrigation. The transition from foraging to farming wasn't a revolution so much as a slow bleed of one way of life into another. At first, the changes would have been barely noticeable. Maybe someone noticed that the wild grains they collected grew more thickly in the disturbed soil around their camp. Maybe someone decided to scatter a few seeds deliberately rather than letting them fall where they may. Maybe someone saved the seeds from the plants they liked best, the ones with larger grains or sweeter taste, or stems that didn't shatter so easily. These small choices, repeated over seasons, over generations, began to accumulate. The plants began to change. They began to adapt not to the wild, but to the human world. Their seeds grew larger. Their stalks grew sturdier. They lost the defenses they needed in the wild, the bitter toxins, the hard shells, the mechanisms for seed dispersal, because humans provided new protections, new ways of spreading. And alongside grains, vegetables began their long domestication. In the Fertile Crescent, it was lentils and peas, chickpeas and fava beans. In China, it was soybeans and rice. In Mesoamerica, it was squash and beans and maize. In the Andes, it was potatoes and quinoa. In Africa, it was yams and sorghum. Each region had its own suite of plants that made the transition from wild to domestic, from forest to field, from occasional gift to reliable staple. And each region developed its own agricultural traditions, its own techniques, its own relationships with the plants that sustained them. But here's what moves me, dear listener. Here's what makes me pause and feel something tender and sad and beautiful all at once. The first farmers almost certainly lived worse than their foraging ancestors. Studies of ancient skeletons show that early agricultural peoples were shorter, less healthy, more prone to disease, and had more dental problems than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. They worked harder for more monotonous diets. They were more vulnerable to famine when crops failed. They lived in denser populations where disease spread more easily. So why did they do it? Why did agriculture spread slowly but inexorably across almost every habitable continent? There are many theories. Some archaeologists argue it was necessity, that climate change and growing populations made foraging unsustainable. Others suggest it was cultural, that the ability to store food enabled new forms of social organization, new hierarchies, new forms of power that some people found appealing even at the cost of general welfare. But I wonder if part of it was simply this: the deep human need to nurture, to improve, to participate in creation. The satisfaction of watching something grow because you planted it. The pride of feeding your children from your own garden. The sense of partnership with the earth, of working with the seasons and soil to create abundance. Because that's what vegetables represent, isn't it? They are the visible proof of that partnership. They are what happens when human care and plant potential meet in soil and sunlight and rain. Let me tell you about one of the first vegetables to be domesticated, the humble lentil. Lentils don't excite most people today. They're small, brownish, unremarkable to look at. But lentils were one of the founding crops of civilization. Archaeological evidence shows that humans in the Fertile Crescent were cultivating lentils as early as 11,000 BCE, making them one of the oldest domesticated vegetables in the world. Imagine being the first person to deliberately plant a lentil. You've gathered wild lentils before, tiny, hard seeds that require patient collection and long cooking to become edible. But you've noticed something. The plants that grow in the disturbed soil near your camp have slightly larger seeds. They're easier to harvest. They taste a little better. So one season, instead of eating all your lentils, you save some. You scatter them near your shelter. You wait. You watch. And when the rains come and the tiny plants push up through the soil, you feel something new. Something that humans hadn't quite felt before, or at least not in this way. You feel hope. Directed hope. Hope planted in the earth like a seed. And when those plants grow and flower and produce their own seeds, larger than their wild cousins, easier to harvest, more suited to your needs, you save the best ones again, and plant them again, and again, and again. Slowly, over decades and centuries, the lentil changes. Its seeds grow larger and more uniform. Its stems grow sturdier, easier to harvest without shattering. It becomes less wild and more domestic, less independent and more reliant on human cultivation. But you change too. Your people change. You can't wander as freely now. You have plants to tend, harvests to protect. You develop new tools for planting and harvesting. You build more permanent shelters. You store surplus in clay pots and woven baskets. You begin to have enough food, sometimes, to feed people who don't directly participate in food production, people who can specialize in making tools or pots or jewelry or thinking about the stars. This is how civilization begins, dear listener. Not with kings or armies or grand declarations, but with lentils, with peas, with chickpeas and fava beans and onions and garlic, with vegetables. Let me tell you a bedtime story about the carrot. Yes, the carrot. That cheerful orange root vegetable that probably sits in your refrigerator right now. So common and familiar that it hardly seems worth a story. But the carrot has traveled further and changed more than almost any vegetable on Earth. And its journey is, in many ways, the journey of all vegetables, from wild to domestic, from bitter to sweet, from regional curiosity to global staple. Close your eyes and travel back with me. We're going to Afghanistan, nearly 1,000 years ago. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Time gets fuzzy that far back, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The wild carrot, which botanists call Daucus carota, has been growing across Europe, Asia, and North Africa for thousands of years. But these ancient carrots bear little resemblance to the vegetables we know today. They're thin, tough, branched roots, more like woody fingers than the smooth, thick cylinders we're used to. And they're not orange. They're white or purple or yellow or a muddy red. And they're bitter, sometimes very bitter, with a sharp, almost medicinal taste. But in Afghanistan and neighboring regions, farmers had been cultivating carrots for centuries, slowly selecting for larger roots, sweeter taste, more tender flesh. By the 10th century, they had developed two distinct varieties, white carrots and purple carrots. The purple ones in particular were prized, not orange purple like some of the carrots you might see today, but deep, almost black purple, the color of a bruise or a storm cloud. These carrots were special. They were vegetables, yes, but they were also medicine. They were food, but also status symbols. The purple ones in particular were associated with wealth and sophistication. They were featured in Persian love poetry. They were served at royal banquets. They were considered to have healing properties, good for the eyes, good for digestion, good for vitality. And then the carrots began to travel. Muslim traders and conquerors brought them west into North Africa and Spain. By the 12th century, carrots were growing in Moorish gardens in Al-Andalus. in that remarkable flowering of Islamic culture on the Iberian Peninsula. From there, they spread throughout the Mediterranean, carried by merchants and pilgrims, by armies and refugees, by anyone who saw value in this useful root that could be stored through winter and grown in varied climates. But they were still purple, still occasionally white or yellow, still sometimes bitter, though less so with each generation of cultivation. The orange carrot, the carrot that would come to dominate the world, that's a much later invention, and it comes from an unexpected place, the Netherlands. Picture the Netherlands in the 16th and 17th centuries. This is the Dutch Golden Age, a time when this small, marshy country became one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in Europe. Dutch ships sailed to every corner of the known world. Dutch banks financed much of European commerce. Dutch painters created masterpieces that still hang in the world's greatest museums. Dutch scientists pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. And Dutch farmers created the orange carrot. It happened through a process called selective breeding, though the farmers doing it wouldn't have used that term. They were just choosing, season after season, to save seeds from the carrots they liked best. And at some point, we don't know exactly when or where or who first did it, Dutch farmers began selecting for carrots with more beta-carotene, that orange pigment that gives carrots and sweet potatoes and pumpkins and many other vegetables their characteristic color. Why orange? The romantic story, the one that gets repeated often, is that Dutch farmers bred orange carrots as a tribute to William of Orange, the founding father of the Netherlands who led the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule. The carrots in this telling were an act of patriotic pride, vegetables painted in the national color. It's a lovely story, and like many lovely stories, it's probably not quite true, or at least not the whole truth. The reality is likely more mundane and more interesting. Orange carrots are sweeter than purple carrots. They're tenderer. The orange color comes from beta-carotene, which not only makes them visually appealing, but also provides vitamin A when we eat them. Though, of course, people in the 1600s didn't know about vitamins, they just knew that orange carrots tasted better and seemed to keep people healthy, especially children. So the orange carrot spread. From the Netherlands to England to France to Germany to the Americas to Australia to every corner of the world where European colonizers and traders went. And it was so successful, so perfectly adapted to human preferences, that it nearly erased the memory of every other color of carrot. Today, if you say carrot, almost everyone in the world pictures an orange root. The purple carrots that were once the standard? Specialty items, heirloom varieties, curiosities for adventurous gardeners. The white carrots, the yellow carrots, the red carrots, all rare, all marginal, all displaced by the orange variety that Dutch farmers perfected 400 years ago. This is what domestication means, dear listener. This is what happens when humans take a wild plant and remake it in the image of their desires. We create something new, something that didn't and couldn't exist without us. But we also erase something old, something wild, something independent. The modern carrot is sweeter, larger, tenderer, more colorful, and more nutritious than any wild carrot. It's also completely dependent on humans. Left to grow wild, cultivated carrots would quickly revert to something more like their wild ancestors, smaller, tougher, more bitter, more varied in color. They've been so changed by domestication that they can't really survive without us anymore. We made them, and in making them, we made them need us. Chapter 4. The Scandalous Tomato. Now, let me tell you about one of the most dramatic journeys any vegetable, or fruit technically, but we eat it like a vegetable so it counts, has ever taken. Let me tell you about the tomato. The tomato's story is one of suspicion and fear, of superstition and science, of how humans can believe for centuries that something deadly is delicious, or that something delicious is deadly. It's a story about how we learn, slowly and stubbornly, to trust our senses over our assumptions. Our story begins in South America, probably in Peru or Ecuador, though Mexico also claims part of the tomato's origin story. The wild ancestors of the tomatoes still grow there, small, berry-sized fruits on sprawling vines. The Spanish word tomate comes from the Nahuatl word tomatl, and the Aztecs were cultivating several varieties of tomato long before Europeans arrived. These early tomatoes weren't the large, round, red fruits we know today. They were small, cherry-sized or smaller, and they came in many colors: yellow, orange, red, purple, even green when ripe. They were important to Mesoamerican cuisines, used in sauces and stews, especially when combined with chilies and other ingredients to make the early versions of what we now call salsa. Then came the Spanish conquistadors. In the early 1500s, Spanish ships began carrying all sorts of American plants back to Europe: potatoes, maize, peppers, chocolate, vanilla, tobacco, and yes, tomatoes. These plants would eventually transform European agriculture and cuisine beyond recognition. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It took centuries. And in the case of the tomato, it almost didn't happen at all, because Europeans were terrified of tomatoes. Imagine being a 16th century European seeing the tomato for the first time. You've never seen anything like it. It's bright red, the color of blood, the color of danger. It grows on a vine that smells strange and sharp when you crush its leaves. And most importantly, it looks suspiciously similar to other plants you know to be deadly poisonous. The tomato belongs to the Solanaceae family, which includes several plants Europeans already knew and feared: belladonna, deadly nightshade, mandrake, and henbane, all of them toxic, some of them lethally so. Belladonna berries in particular look quite similar to tomatoes, and eating just a few of them can kill an adult. So when tomatoes arrived in Europe, many people looked at them and saw poison. They grew them as ornamental plants. They're quite beautiful after all, but they didn't eat them. Or if they did eat them, they did so with great suspicion and trepidation. Wealthy Europeans were especially afraid of tomatoes for a reason that's both scientific and sadly ironic. They ate from pewter plates, which contained lead. Tomatoes are highly acidic, and that acid would leach the lead from the plates. People would eat tomatoes from pewter plates, get lead poisoning, and conclude that tomatoes were toxic. They weren't wrong that they were being poisoned, they were just wrong about what was poisoning them. This fear of tomatoes persisted in some parts of Europe, and especially in England and North America, well into the 1800s. There are accounts of American colonists growing tomatoes purely as decorative plants, believing them to be poisonous. They called them poison apples or wolf peaches. But not everyone was afraid. In Italy and Spain, in southern France and Portugal, people were eating tomatoes by the 1600s, and they were doing more than just eating them. They were transforming them, cultivating them, falling in love with them. The Italians in particular embraced the tomato with passion. By the 18th century, tomatoes were essential to Italian cuisine in ways that feel timeless now, though they were actually quite new. The first tomato sauce recipes appear in Italian cookbooks in the late 1600s. The first recipe specifically for pasta with tomato sauce shows up in 1790. Think about that. Pizza with tomato sauce, that iconic, supposedly ancient Italian dish, couldn't have existed before tomatoes arrived from the Americas. The Italy we think of when we think of Italian food, rich with tomato sauce and sun-dried tomatoes and tomato paste and fresh tomatoes on every table, that Italy is only a few centuries old. Before the tomato, Italian cuisine was something entirely different. The tomato didn't just add to Italian cooking, it transformed it. It became so central, so essential, so deeply integrated into the culture that most Italians would be surprised to learn their ancestors once lived without tomatoes. That's how completely the tomato won over Italian hearts. But in England and North America, resistance continued. Thomas Jefferson, who gardened extensively at Monticello and grew all sorts of unusual plants, recorded growing tomatoes in 1781, but we don't know if he ate them. Many Americans still believed well into the 1800s that tomatoes were poisonous. The turning point, and this is where the story gets theatrical, supposedly came in 1820. A man named Robert Gibbon Johnson announced that he would eat an entire basket of tomatoes on the courthouse steps in Salem, New Jersey. A crowd gathered to watch him die from the poisonous fruit. A band played a funeral dirge. Johnson ate the tomatoes, all of them. The crowd waited. Johnson didn't die. He didn't even get sick. He just stood there, tomato juice on his chin, very much alive and quite pleased with himself. This story is probably apocryphal. Historians haven't found reliable contemporary accounts of the event. But true or not, it captures something real about the tomato's journey from feared to beloved. It took courage, or showmanship, or perhaps just hunger and practicality to overcome centuries of superstition. By the late 1800s, tomatoes had won. They were being grown commercially. Canned tomatoes became one of the first successful canned foods. Tomato soup, tomato juice, tomato sauce all became staples of American and European diets. The plant that had been feared as poison became one of the most popular vegetables, or fruits, or whatever you want to call them, in the world. Today, tomatoes are the second most consumed vegetable in the world, after potatoes. We eat them fresh in salads, cooked in sauces, dried in the sun, canned for storage, pureed into paste and juice. We've bred them into hundreds of varieties: tiny cherry tomatoes, no bigger than a grape, massive beefsteak tomatoes that can weigh a pound or more, yellow tomatoes and purple tomatoes and striped tomatoes, and tomatoes in every shade of red. We've also, in our enthusiasm, done something that makes me a little sad, though I understand why we did it. Modern commercial tomatoes, the ones you find in most grocery stores, have been bred for qualities that make them profitable, but not necessarily delicious. They're bred to be uniform in size and shape, to ripen all at once for easy mechanical harvesting, to have thick skins that resist bruising during transport, to have long shelf life. But in breeding for these qualities, we've bred out some of the complexity of flavor that made heirloom tomatoes so special. That's why tomatoes from the grocery store often taste like, well, like red water, like the idea of a tomato without the reality of one. But there's good news, dear listener. There's a counter-movement, small but growing. Heirloom tomatoes, varieties that have been passed down through generations of families and farmers, selected for flavor rather than profit, are making a comeback. Farmers markets and home gardens are bringing back the Cherokee Purple, the Brandywine, the Green Zebra, the Black Crim. Tomatoes that taste like summer and sun and earth, the way tomatoes used to taste before we industrialized them. This is one of the beautiful things about vegetables. They're resilient, they remember. And when we remember to care about flavor over convenience, about diversity over uniformity, the vegetables remember too. They express all that potential that lives in their genes, waiting for someone to care enough to bring it forth. The tomato came from the mountains of South America as a small wild berry. Humans brought it around the world, feared it, loved it, transformed it, industrialized it, and now, in some quarters, are trying to return to something closer to what it was. Not wild, but not quite so tamed either. Something in between. Something that tastes like partnership rather than domination. That's the tomato's journey. From tomato to poison apple to Italian icon to grocery store commodity to heirloom treasure. And it's not over yet. The story is still being written in gardens and greenhouses and fields around the world by anyone who plants a seed and tends what grows. I need to tell you about the potato. I need to tell you because the potato's story is perhaps the most dramatic, most consequential, most world-changing story any vegetable has to tell. It's a story of empires and famines, of life and death, on a scale that's hard to comprehend. So, settle deeper into your blankets, dear listener. This story has darkness in it. But it has light, too. And it has a lesson we still haven't fully learned about what happens when we put all our faith in a single plant. The potato, like the tomato, comes from South America, specifically from the Andes Mountains, from the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, where the air is thin and the nights are cold and few plants can survive the harsh conditions. But the potato can. The potato is tough. It grows underground, protected from frost and hail and the burning highland sun. It's nutritious, full of carbohydrates, yes, but also vitamin C, potassium, and enough protein to sustain human life if you eat enough of them. It's productive. A single seed potato can produce many pounds of food from a small plot of land. And it's storable. Kept in cool, dark conditions, potatoes can last for months. The Incas didn't just grow potatoes, they worshipped them. They had a potato god. They measured time by how long it took to cook a potato. They developed sophisticated freeze-drying techniques to preserve potatoes for years, creating something called chuño that could sustain armies on long marches and populations through bad harvests. When Spanish conquistadors came to the Andes in the 1500s, they found the Incas eating something they had never seen before. These strange tubers, these pale lumps dug from the earth. The Spanish took them back to Europe, along with gold and silver and all the other treasures they plundered. But unlike gold and silver, the potato's value wasn't immediately obvious to Europeans. Once again, we have the problem of the Solanaceae family. The potato is a cousin to the tomato, to belladonna, to all those poisonous nightshades, and indeed, the leaves and stems of the potato plant are toxic. The potato itself, if left in light, can turn green and develop solanine, a toxin that can make you sick. So Europeans were suspicious. They fed potatoes to animals first, to prisoners, to people they considered expendable. They noticed that the potato plant flowered in pretty purple blooms and started growing them as ornamentals. Some people ate the leaves and stems, not realizing those were the poisonous parts, and got sick, which confirmed everyone's worst fears. It took a long time, almost 2 centuries, for the potato to be accepted in most of Europe, but when it was finally accepted, it changed everything. The potato arrived in Ireland around 1590. For the first century or so, it was a curiosity, a garden vegetable, nothing special. But slowly, Irish farmers began to realize what the Incas had known for thousands of years. The potato was special. It could grow in Ireland's cool, wet climate better than wheat or barley. It produced more calories per acre than any grain. It was nutritious enough to sustain a family. It required relatively little labor to cultivate. And the British landlords who controlled most of Ireland's farmland didn't consider it a cash crop, so Irish farmers could grow it for themselves without having to hand it over as rent or tax. By the early 1800s, the potato had become the staple food of Ireland, especially for the poor. And by staple, I mean that many Irish peasants ate almost nothing else. An adult man might eat 10 to 14 pounds of potatoes a day. Potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, potatoes for dinner. Maybe some milk or fish occasionally, but mostly potatoes. This dependence on a single crop worried some people. Agricultural experts warned that it was dangerous. Economists pointed out the risks. But the potato was so productive, so reliable, so perfectly suited for Irish conditions that the warnings were ignored. And then came the blight. In the autumn of 1845, a fungus-like organism called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Ireland. We now know it came from North America, probably in a shipment of seed potatoes. It spread invisibly, carried on the wind, on tools, on people's shoes and clothes. At first, the potato plants looked healthy. They grew green and strong. They flowered as they should. But then, suddenly, the leaves began to darken and curl. A disgusting smell emerged from the fields. When farmers dug up their potatoes, expecting a harvest, they found instead rotting, blackened tubers that dissolved into foul-smelling mush in their hands. The blight spread across Ireland in weeks. It destroyed roughly half the potato crop in 1845, and then it came back in 1846, more virulent than before, destroying almost everything, and again in 1848, and again in 1849. 4 years of failed harvests, 4 years of famine, 4 years that would forever change Ireland and echo through Irish history and the Irish diaspora down to this very day. The Great Famine, or the Great Hunger as it's known in Ireland, killed approximately 1 million people. Another million or more emigrated, fleeing starvation, crowding onto ships that were sometimes called coffin ships because so many passengers died during the voyage. Ireland's population in 1841 was about 8 million. By 1851, it was 6.5 million. The island lost a quarter of its people in a single decade. Some villages were completely emptied. Some families were erased from existence. The Irish language, which had already been in decline, suffered a catastrophic loss of speakers from which it has never recovered. And here's what makes this tragedy even darker, dear listener, even more unbearable. Ireland was exporting food during the famine. While people starved in the fields and roadsides and overcrowded workhouses, ships full of wheat and oats and barley left Irish ports for England. The British landlords who owned much of Ireland's farmland continued to demand rent and export crops, even as their tenants died. The British government, guided by a cruel ideology that held that markets should not be interfered with and that the famine was a natural correction to overpopulation, provided inadequate relief, and sometimes none at all. This was not just a crop failure. This was a political failure, a moral failure, a failure of human compassion on a massive scale. I tell you this not to ruin your peaceful evening, dear listener, but because it's part of the potato's story. Because vegetables are not neutral. They exist in political contexts, in economic systems, in power structures. The potato didn't cause the famine. Humans did, through the systems they created and maintained. But the potato was the mechanism through which those failures played out. And there's a lesson here about biodiversity, about putting all your eggs or all your potatoes in one basket. The Irish potatoes that the Incas grew were almost entirely one variety, the Irish lumper, not because it was the best tasting or most nutritious, but because it was the most productive and easiest to grow. When the blight came, it found a massive, genetically uniform crop, millions and millions of potato plants that were essentially clones of each other, all equally susceptible to the disease. There was no diversity to slow the blight, no resistant varieties to fall back on. The Incas, by contrast, grew hundreds of varieties of potatoes. They had potatoes adapted to different elevations, different soils, different climates. They had potatoes with different colors, flavors, textures, uses. When a disease struck one variety, they had others to fall back on. Biodiversity is resilience. Uniformity is fragility. It's a lesson we learned from the Irish potato famine, and then, tragically, promptly forgot. But the potato's story doesn't end in darkness. The potato survived the blight. It survived because people worked to save it, to understand it, to breed resistance into it. Scientists began studying the blight, trying to understand what it was and how it worked. Farmers began seeking out different varieties, preserving diversity. Plant breeders began creating new varieties that combined productivity with disease resistance. And the potato continued its journey around the world. It became a staple crop in Germany, in Russia, in China. It fed armies and sustained populations through wars and hardships. It became French fries and potato chips and mashed potatoes and potato salad and countless other forms. Today, the potato is the world's fourth most important food crop after rice, wheat, and maize. It's grown on every continent except Antarctica. It feeds more than 1 billion people. It's been to space aboard space stations. There are more than 4,000 native varieties in the Andes alone, and thousands more varieties created by breeders around the world. The potato that was once feared and rejected has become one of humanity's most important partnerships with the plant world, not despite its dark history, but having learned from it, having grown through it. That's resilience, dear listener. That's what vegetables and people can do. We can fail catastrophically and still continue. Still grow, still feed the world. Let's talk about the onion. The onion is one of the oldest cultivated vegetables in the world. We've been growing onions for at least 5,000 years, possibly 7,000 years. They appear in ancient Egyptian tomb paintings and Sumerian cuneiform tablets. They were part of the rations given to the workers who built the pyramids. They were buried with pharaohs to sustain them in the afterlife. Ancient physicians in Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, India prescribed onions for dozens of ailments. Onions for strength, onions for digestion, onions for wounds, onions for practically everything. Onion juice to prevent scurvy, onion poultices for inflammation, onions rubbed on the chest for coughs and breathing problems. Were all these remedies effective? Probably not, but onions do have genuine antibacterial properties. They do contain vitamin C and other nutrients. They do have sulfur compounds that can have mild medicinal effects. The ancient physicians weren't entirely wrong, just hopeful and working with the tools they had. But medicinal uses aside, what made onions so universal, so ancient, so persistently part of human diet across almost every culture? The answer is simple. Onions make everything taste better. Think about the last time you cooked. I mean, really cooked, not just reheated something or assembled a sandwich, but actually cooked from raw ingredients. Chances are you started with an onion. Diced onion, sliced onion, chopped onion, whole onion, whatever the recipe called for. You probably heated some fat, oil or butter in a pan, added the onion, and cooked it until it softened and turned translucent, or golden, or deeply caramelized depending on your patience in your recipe. This is called a sofrito in Italian cuisine, a mirepoix in French, a trinity in Cajun cooking. Different names, slightly different proportions and additions, but the same basic principle. You start with onions. Sometimes you add carrots and celery, sometimes peppers, sometimes garlic, sometimes ginger. But almost always you start with onions. Why? Because as onions cook, their sharp, sulfurous bite mellows into sweetness. Their cells break down and release sugars. They become soft, yielding, almost creamy. They distribute their flavor throughout whatever you're cooking, providing a savory base note that makes everything else taste more like itself. The onion doesn't dominate, it doesn't shout, it whispers, it suggests, it enhances. A great onion, cooked properly, doesn't taste like onion so much as it tastes like depth, like savory satisfaction, like the idea of deliciousness itself. This is why onions are one of the most consumed vegetables on Earth. This is why virtually every cuisine in the world uses them. This is why they've been cultivated continuously for millennia. They're not flashy. They don't have the tomato's dramatic transformation from feared to beloved. They don't have the potato's world historical importance. They're just onions. Reliable, humble, always there when you need them, making everything better without asking for credit. And yes, they make you cry. That's the onion's defense mechanism, its remnant of wildness. When you cut an onion, you rupture its cells and release enzymes that react with sulfur compounds to create a volatile gas. That gas drifts up into your eyes and reacts with the moisture there to form sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid in your eyes. No wonder you cry. Your tears are not sadness, they're defense. Your body is trying to wash away the irritant, to protect your precious vision from this chemical assault. But here's the beautiful thing, the thing that moves me about onions and tears and cooking. We don't stop chopping. The onion makes us cry, and we cry, and we keep chopping, because we know that the tears are temporary and the flavor is worth it, because we've learned to accept the onion's small violence as the price of its gift. There are tricks, of course. Cut the onion under running water, or refrigerate it first, or wear swimming goggles if you're particularly sensitive. Use a very sharp knife to rupture fewer cells. Light a candle nearby to burn off some of the volatile compounds. Breathe through your mouth instead of your nose. But most of us just cry. We've made peace with it. It's part of the ritual of cooking, part of the small sacrifices we make to create something nourishing and delicious. The onion teaches us this, that some tears are worth crying, that some discomfort is the necessary price of transformation, that the sharp, biting thing that makes you weep can, with heat and time and patience, become sweet. We've traveled far together tonight, dear listener, through time and across continents, through famines and feasts, fears and love affairs. But I want to take you somewhere quieter now, somewhere dark and patient, somewhere we rarely think about but that sustains all the life we can see. I want to take you underground, into the soil, into the secret world where roots live. Because many vegetables, perhaps the most primal, the most ancient, the most essential, are roots. They're the parts of plants that we never see in life, that exist in darkness, that work in secret to gather what the plant needs to survive. Carrots, turnips, radishes, beets, parsnips, rutabagas, celeriac, salsify, horseradish, all roots. The potato, technically, is a tuber, a swollen underground stem, but it lives in the same dark world. Sweet potatoes are storage roots. Ginger and turmeric are rhizomes, underground stems that spread horizontally. All of these vegetables are doing the same thing, storing energy underground where it's safe from predators and weather, where it can wait through winter or drought, where it can fuel next year's growth. And humans, clever humans, have learned to steal that stored energy for ourselves. Imagine you're a root vegetable. Let's say you're a carrot, since we've already gotten to know carrots a bit. You begin as a tiny seed, smaller than a freckle, containing within it all the information needed to become a carrot. When conditions are right, when the soil is warm enough, moist enough, when the season is right, you germinate. First comes the root, pushing down into the darkness, seeking water and minerals. Then comes the shoot, pushing up toward the light. You split your attention from the very beginning, half of you reaching for the sun, half of you diving into the earth. Your leaves unfold in the light, lacy and delicate like a fern, and begin the ancient magic of photosynthesis. They catch sunlight, that fusion energy radiating from the sun 93 million miles away, and use it to split water molecules and rearrange carbon dioxide from the air into sugar, into food, into energy. But you don't use that energy right away. You're a biennial plant, which means your life plan spans 2 years. This first year is all about preparation. You're going to store as much energy as possible underground in your root, and then wait out the winter in a state of suspended animation. Next spring, you'll use all that stored energy to quickly shoot up a flower stalk, to bloom and make seeds before the hot summer comes. That's the plan anyway. That's what you would do if you were wild. But you're not wild. You're domesticated. You're growing in a garden or a farm, planted by humans who have been shaping your ancestors for thousands of years. And those humans aren't going to let you get to year 2. Sometime in late summer or early fall, when you've swollen your root with stored sugars until it's thick and orange and sweet, a human is going to come with a tool, a fork or their hands, and they're going to pull you out of the earth. Your carefully stored energy, your winter survival plan, your preparation for next year's flowers and seeds, they're going to eat it. From the plant's perspective, this is tragedy. All that work, all that careful storage, stolen before it can be used. From the human perspective, this is dinner. This is nutrition. This is the reward for the work of planting and weeding and watering and waiting. This is the fundamental relationship of agriculture. Humans providing conditions for plants to grow, plants providing food for humans, and neither party quite getting what they originally evolved for, but both surviving, even thriving, in this strange partnership. Roots grow in darkness, but they're extraordinarily sensitive to their environment. They can sense gravity and grow downward. They can sense water and grow toward it. They can sense nutrients and proliferate in rich patches of soil. They can sense rocks and other obstacles and grow around them. Recent research suggests that roots can even sense sound, specifically the sound of running water, and grow toward it. They might be able to sense the chemical signals released by neighboring plants and respond to them. They live in constant communication with the soil, with fungi, with bacteria, with other roots. The underground world is not dead and quiet. It's alive. It's busy. It's a network of relationships and exchanges every bit as complex as what happens above ground, maybe more so. When you eat a carrot, you're eating the storage organ of a plant that was in constant conversation with the earth. You're eating sunlight that was caught by leaves and converted to sugar and sent down into darkness for safekeeping. You're eating minerals pulled from the soil by root hairs so fine you can barely see them. Minerals that came from rocks broken down over millennia by water and ice and time. You're eating transformed stone and captured light. You're eating the patient work of the earth. Every root vegetable carries this same story. The beet's deep purple flesh comes from betalains, pigments that the plant makes for reasons we don't fully understand, possibly to protect against stress, possibly to attract certain animals. The radish's sharp, peppery bite comes from glucosinolates, defensive chemicals that the plant uses to deter pests, but that humans happen to enjoy. The sweet potato's orange flesh is full of beta-carotene, that same pigment that makes carrots orange, stored there not for our benefit, but as a way for the plant to stockpile nutrients. We eat these vegetables, and we're eating plant strategies, plant chemistry, plant wisdom. We're eating the work of organisms that have been perfecting the art of survival for millions of years longer than humans have existed. I need to tell you about something sad now, dear listener. I need to tell you about absence, about the vegetables that used to exist and don't anymore, or barely do, about diversity lost, about the narrowing of our relationship with the plant world. For most of human history, we ate an astonishing variety of plants. Hunter-gatherers typically had hundreds of plant species in their diets. Early agricultural societies grew dozens of different crops in intricate polycultures, mixing plants that supported each other, that matured at different times, that provided different nutrients. But as agriculture industrialized, as monoculture became the norm, as global supply chains began demanding uniformity and shelf stability and year-round availability, that diversity collapsed. Today, 75% of the world's food comes from just 12 plant species. 12 out of tens of thousands of edible plants. 3 crops, rice, wheat, and maize, provide more than half of all plant-derived calories consumed by humans. Add in potatoes, soybeans, and palm oil, and you're up to 2/3 of global plant calories from just 6 species. This is unprecedented in human history. We've never relied on so few plants for so much of our food. And while those few plants feed billions of people, which is genuinely miraculous, the loss of diversity makes us vulnerable in ways that echo the Irish potato famine. When you depend on 1 or 2 varieties of a crop and a disease comes that those varieties are susceptible to, you're in trouble. When climate changes and your few crops aren't adapted to the new conditions, you're in trouble. When you've lost the traditional knowledge of how to grow and prepare hundreds of other edible plants, you're in trouble. Let me tell you about some vegetables that have been lost or nearly lost. Skirret was once a common root vegetable in Europe, grown from Roman times through the medieval period. It tastes sweet, something like a cross between a carrot and a parsnip, but it was displaced by the potato in the 18th and 19th centuries, and today is almost completely forgotten. You can find seeds from specialty heirloom companies, but almost no one grows it commercially. Scorzonera, or black salsify, was popular in 17th and 18th century Europe. It has a delicate, oyster-like flavor, but it's difficult to harvest. The roots are long and thin and break easily, so it fell out of commercial favor. It still grows in some European gardens, but has largely vanished from markets. Sea kale, a coastal plant that produces tender shoots in spring, was a delicacy in Victorian England. It can still be found in specialty gardens, but has nearly disappeared from general cultivation. Good King Henry, a leafy green similar to spinach, was grown as a staple vegetable in England for centuries. It's almost unknown now. And these are just European examples. Every agricultural region has its own list of lost or forgotten vegetables. In North America, there's the groundnut, a protein-rich tuber that was a staple food for many indigenous peoples. In Africa, there are dozens of traditional leafy greens that have been displaced by introduced crops. In Asia, countless regional vegetables are disappearing as food systems globalize. The Ark of Taste, a project by the Slow Food Foundation, has cataloged more than 5,000 heritage foods, including many vegetables that are at risk of extinction. Not botanical extinction necessarily, but cultural extinction. These are foods that people still could grow and eat, but mostly don't, either because they've been forgotten, or because they're not economically viable in modern markets, or because the knowledge of how to grow and prepare them is being lost. Every time a vegetable variety disappears, we lose more than just genetic diversity. We lose the accumulated knowledge of the farmers who selected and saved those seeds. We lose the traditional recipes and preparation methods. We lose the cultural associations and memories and stories. We lose flavors that we'll never taste again. We lose possibilities. But there's hope, too, dear listener. There's a growing movement to recover some of what's been lost. Seed savers around the world are collecting, growing, and sharing heirloom varieties of vegetables. They're keeping alive varieties that might otherwise disappear, preserving not just genes, but also the stories and knowledge that go with them. Organizations like Seed Savers Exchange, Native Seeds Search, and countless others are building living libraries of agricultural diversity. Home gardeners are growing rare varieties in their backyards. Chefs are seeking out unusual vegetables and creating demand for them. Farmers markets are becoming showcases for diversity rather than uniformity. There's a rediscovery happening, a remembering. People are learning to grow and cook with salsify and scorzonera and skirret. They're seeking out purple carrots and white tomatoes and yellow beets. They're asking their grandparents and great-grandparents what vegetables they remember from their childhoods. They're finding old seed packets and planting them to see what comes up. It's a small movement, certainly. It's not going to replace industrial agriculture or feed 8 billion people on its own. But it's preserving something precious. It's maintaining diversity as a kind of insurance policy against an uncertain future. It's keeping alive the knowledge and the genes and the stories that we might desperately need someday. And it's beautiful, dear listener. It's beautiful to see purple and yellow and white carrots growing in a garden alongside orange ones. It's beautiful to taste a tomato variety that your great-grandmother might have grown. It's beautiful to participate, even in a small way, in the long conversation between humans and plants that have sustained us since the beginning. The vegetables we lost are not entirely gone, as long as someone, somewhere, is saving their seeds and keeping their stories alive. We've traveled through the past tonight, dear listener, through ancient fields and medieval gardens, through famines and feasts, through the long, slow transformation of wild plants into domestic partners. But what about the future? What vegetables will our great-grandchildren eat? What new partnerships are we creating right now? The truth is, vegetables are still evolving. Agriculture is still happening. The conversation between humans and plants hasn't ended. It's just entered a new, stranger phase. We have technologies now that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. We can read the entire genetic code of a plant. We can identify exactly which genes control which traits. We can even, controversially, edit those genes directly, making specific changes to create plants with desired characteristics. We have broccolini, a hybrid of broccoli and Chinese kale, created in Japan in 1993. It didn't exist before. Now you can buy it in grocery stores. We have the Colette, a cross between kale and Brussels sprouts, developed in the UK in the 2000s. It's patented, branded, marketed like a new product, because in a sense, that's exactly what it is. We have purple cauliflower, orange cauliflower, Romanesco with its fractal spirals, all developments of the past few decades, created by plant breeders selecting for unusual traits. And we have genetically modified vegetables, though far fewer than you might think. Most GMO crops are corn, soybeans, cotton, and canola, commodity crops used for animal feed, cooking oil, and industrial purposes. The only GMO vegetables commonly available to consumers are some squash, some sweet corn, and some potatoes engineered to resist specific diseases or pests. This is where the conversation about vegetables gets complicated, where people's feelings and fears and hopes all tangle together. Some people see genetic modification as a natural continuation of the domestication process we've been doing for 10,000 years. They point out that every vegetable we eat has been genetically modified through selective breeding, that modern vegetables are so different from their wild ancestors that they wouldn't survive without human help. They argue that new technologies just speed up a process that's always been happening, and that we need these tools to feed a growing population and adapt to climate change. Other people see genetic modification as something categorically different, as humans playing God or messing with nature in dangerous ways. They worry about unintended consequences, about corporations controlling the food supply through patented seeds, about the loss of traditional varieties and farming practices. They prefer organic methods, heirloom varieties, slower approaches that feel more in harmony with natural processes. I'm not going to tell you which side is right, dear listener. That's not my place, and it's not the kind of question that has a simple answer. What I will tell you is that both perspectives come from real concerns, real values, real experiences, and both are worth listening to. What I find most interesting is not the technology itself, but the questions it raises about our relationship with the natural world. Are we part of nature or separate from it? When we change plants to suit our needs, are we working with nature or against it? Where's the line between helpful cultivation and harmful exploitation? How much control should we exert, and how much should we accept what's given? These aren't new questions. They're the same questions humans have been asking since the first person decided to plant a seed instead of just gathering what grew wild. But the technologies we have now make the questions more urgent, the stakes higher, the consequences more far-reaching. One thing that gives me hope, though, is that we're also using technology to better understand and support traditional agricultural practices. Scientists are studying indigenous farming methods and discovering sophisticated techniques that modern industrial agriculture lost. Polyculture, crop rotation, companion planting, soil building, practices that traditional farmers developed through generations of observation and experimentation, are being validated and improved by scientific research. We're learning that the old ways weren't primitive. They were sophisticated, complex, adapted to local conditions in ways that monoculture never can be. We're learning that diversity isn't just romantic or nostalgic. It's practical, resilient, necessary. We're developing technologies that support rather than replace traditional practices. Apps that help seed savers catalog and share varieties. DNA analysis that can verify the authenticity of heirloom seeds. Climate modeling that helps farmers adapt traditional crops to changing conditions. And we're seeing a growing recognition that vegetables are not just commodities, not just nutrients, not just products to be optimized for yield and shelf life. They're living things with their own histories and needs. They're partners in a relationship that works best when both parties thrive. The vegetables of tomorrow, I hope, will honor both innovation and tradition. They'll use the best of modern science and the wisdom of ancient practice. They'll be diverse and resilient. They'll be nutritious and delicious. They'll be grown in ways that support rather than deplete the soil. They'll be accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy. That's the dream anyway. Whether we achieve it depends on choices we're making right now, individually and collectively. What we choose to eat, what we choose to grow, what we choose to support with our money and our attention and our care. Let's come back to something immediate now, dear listener, something you can touch and taste and experience directly. Let's talk about the vegetables in your kitchen right now. Even if you think you have no vegetables, I bet you have some. An onion in the pantry, maybe, a jar of tomato sauce, a head of wilting lettuce in the back of the refrigerator, a frozen bag of mixed vegetables in the freezer, something. Some connection, however tenuous, to this long story we've been exploring together. And here's what I want you to understand. Those vegetables in your kitchen carry all of this history with them. That onion is descended from onions that fed pyramid builders. That tomato sauce contains the fruit that Europeans once feared as poison. That frozen broccoli is a cultivated form of a wild mustard plant that still grows along Mediterranean coasts. Every vegetable is a story. Every vegetable is a miracle. Think about it. A carrot starts as a seed so small you can barely see it. You plant it in dirt, dead leaves, broken rocks, decomposed organisms, minerals leached from bedrock over millions of years. You add water, which fell from the sky in a cycle that's been running since the Earth's oceans formed billions of years ago. The seed absorbs the water, swells, splits open. A tiny root emerges and pushes down. A tiny shoot emerges and pushes up. The plant grows. Its leaves spread and catch sunlight, the same fusion reactions that created all the heavy elements in your body happening 93 million miles away, sending photons on an 8-minute journey to your garden. The plant uses that light to split water molecules and grab carbon dioxide from the air and rearrange them into sugars, into starches, into all the complex molecules that make up its cells. All summer, the plant works, taking sun and rain and air and soil and transforming them into more plant, More leaves, longer roots, a thickening storage organ that swells with concentrated energy. And then you pull it up, brush off the dirt, take it inside, cut it up, cook it, eat it. And your body takes that stored sunlight, those transformed minerals, that concentrated growth, and uses it to build your own cells, to power your own movements, to fuel your own thoughts. You are made of vegetables, literally. The atoms in your body came from the food you ate, which came from the soil and the air and the sun. You are walking, talking, thinking soil and sunlight, rearranged into human form. This is what eating means, dear listener. This is what vegetables give us. Not just nutrition, though they do give us that. Not just flavor, though they do that too. But connection, participation, a direct physical link to the earth and the sun and the rain. When you eat a vegetable, you're participating in one of the oldest relationships on earth. The same relationship that sustained your ancestors, that built civilizations, that enabled everything you are and have and know. And you can honor that relationship. You can pay attention to it. You can choose vegetables that were grown with care for the soil and the farmers who grew them. You can learn to cook them in ways that bring out their natural flavors. You can try new varieties, new preparations, new ways of experiencing these familiar foods. You can grow some yourself, even if it's just herbs on a windowsill or a tomato plant on a balcony. You can save seeds and share them. You can learn the names and histories of the vegetables you eat. Or you can just eat them with gratitude, with awareness, with appreciation for the long journey they took to reach your plate. That's enough. That's more than enough. Because vegetables don't demand worship or complicated rituals. They just ask to be eaten, to be appreciated, to be part of the continuing conversation between humans and the earth that sustains us.